Welcome to my channel. Subscribe, listen and enjoy my stories every day. Sitting across from Molly at dinner, I felt the weight of words unsaid. The past few weeks had been a torturous exercise in keeping my suspicions buried. Each time she looked up, eyes glancing past me instead of at me, I felt the bond we'd built over a decade crack just a bit more. We were always a close pair, or at least that's what I thought. But lately, each business trip and late night at the office had gnawed at me, leaving me wondering if she was the woman I'd pledged to love and trust. It wasn't until last month, on a rainy Thursday, that I stumbled upon a hidden detail that started to reveal her secret. I was in the garage, clearing out old boxes stacked from floor to ceiling to make space for our new lawn mower. Molly had insisted on buying one of those zero-turn mowers, to make things easier, she'd said, but it was starting to feel more like an excuse to have me distracted. As I shifted boxes, something fell from the shelf, a crumpled-up envelope, half open, with her name scribbled on it in red marker. I wouldn't have paid it much mind, but curiosity won over. Inside the envelope was a handful of receipts. I unfolded one, then another, my stomach tightening as I read them: Radisson Hotel, Orlando, Bistro Noir, the Velvet Room. These weren't places Molly would have mentioned. She wasn't even supposed to be in Orlando. She'd been visiting her mother in Jacksonville, or so I'd thought. The hotel receipts had dates that overlapped with her supposed family visits. My mind raced as the realization settled, and a hollow, sick feeling crept over me. She hadn't been with her mother. She was somewhere else entirely, and worse, someone else might have been with her. But I didn't confront her. Not right away. Instead, I spent the next week piecing things together, finding excuses to check her phone and her credit card bills. The evidence piled up, each new detail confirming my worst fears. There were payments to boutique hotels, restaurants we'd never been to, Uber rides in the middle of the night. The name Jeremy started to appear more often than I could ignore, attached to small notes in her calendar and hurried, last-minute changes to her schedule. Jeremy wasn't a friend I knew. He wasn't a colleague. He was someone else entirely, someone who had slipped into her life and, somehow, into mine as well. By the time Molly came home that Friday night, my heart had already accepted what my mind didn't want to believe. She walked in with her usual, practiced ease, setting her keys down on the counter and glancing over with that innocent smile she'd perfected over the years. "How was your day?" she asked, voice light, pretending everything was just as it always was. I nodded, swallowing the anger boiling in my throat. "Busy. You know, usual Friday." I waited for her to say something, anything that might crack her facade, but she didn't. Instead, she grabbed a glass of water and casually mentioned she'd be working late again the following week, maybe even on Saturday. I nodded, mentally filing away the lie. The next few days blurred by as I kept myself occupied, wondering what to do, how to confront her. Every time I came close, I found myself backing down, thinking of the life we'd built, the promises we'd made, and the years we had put into this marriage. It felt surreal, like I was living in someone else's story, one of those tales you hear about but never think will happen to you. But I knew I couldn't keep quiet forever. The betrayal was too deep, too raw to ignore. The following weekend, she slipped again. She mentioned she'd be meeting the girls for brunch but would likely head into work afterward to catch up on some things. The story was too perfect, too rehearsed. As she spoke, I realized she was spinning the same script she'd probably used with Jeremy, the lines she'd prepared in her mind to cover her tracks. But this time, I'd had enough. I waited until she left and, without hesitation, drove to the restaurant where she claimed she'd be meeting her friends. I parked across the street, scanning the sidewalk. Time passed as I waited, watching the brunch crowd filter in and out, laughing, chatting, oblivious to the tension building inside me. Finally, I saw her. She wasn't alone. Beside her was a man I instantly recognized, even though I'd never seen him in person before. I'd seen his name enough, the receipts, the clues, the calendar notes. Jeremy. I stayed in my car, watching as they walked together into the restaurant, arm in arm. It was almost too casual, too practiced. I felt a mix of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. This wasn't just some fling. She'd built a routine with him, a life outside of ours, with a man she trusted enough to meet in public, to share moments with that were supposed to be ours. But even then, I didn't confront her. I wanted her to feel the same creeping realization I had felt, that something wasn't right, that the world she tried to balance was about to come crashing down. When she returned home that evening, I acted as if nothing had changed. I let her explain her work meeting, the long hours, the tired sighs as if she'd spent the day behind a desk and not in the arms of another man. The following week, I made plans of my own. There was a restaurant she loved, a place we'd gone to every anniversary, every special occasion. I made a reservation, thinking of how it would be the last meal we'd share as husband and wife. When I asked her out, she accepted, perhaps sensing something in my tone, a finality I'd tried to mask. That night, we sat across from each other, sharing the same table but in a different world. I watched her, seeing the traces of deception in the way she looked around, in the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She tried to talk about work, about friends, about plans for the future, but I didn't hear a word of it. My mind was somewhere else, lost in the betrayal that had tainted every memory, every moment we'd shared. Finally, when she looked up, sensing the weight of my silence, I leaned forward, meeting her gaze. "I know, Molly," I said, my voice low, steady. I watched her eyes widen, the color drain from her face as the reality sank in. "I know about you and Jeremy. I know about the hotels, the restaurants, the lies." She opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off. "You don't have to explain. I just wanted you to know that I know. And I wanted to give you a chance to come clean before I decide what happens next." She sat there, stunned, unable to meet my gaze. For the first time, the facade crumbled, and she was just Molly, no excuses, no defenses. Just a woman who had shattered the life we'd built together. The silence between us lingered long after I confronted her, stretching across the table like a wall. Molly's expression was a mixture of guilt, shock, and defiance. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came. I could see her mind racing, her eyes darting around, trying to find the right combination of words to fix this, to turn back time, to make everything disappear. She finally managed to whisper, I'm sorry." Her voice cracked, and for a moment, I wondered if the apology was genuine or just another performance. The Molly I thought I knew would never betray me, but here she was, barefaced and guilty, without the shield of lies she'd constructed over months. "How long?" I asked, keeping my tone calm, though inside, my anger was rising again. "How long have you been seeing him, Molly?" Her eyes dropped to the table, fingers twisting her napkin as she avoided my gaze. It's been a few months. It happened, and I didn't mean for it to get this far." I laughed, bitterly. "Didn't mean for it to get this far? You've been lying to me, sneaking around, staying in hotels. That takes planning, Molly, not a mistake." She flinched, and for a split second, I felt a pang of something that used to be love. But it faded as quickly as it came, replaced by the cold realization that the woman I'd trusted with everything had broken our vows without a second thought. She started talking, words spilling out in a desperate attempt to make sense of her actions. "I don't know how it happened, really. I guess I was lonely, and Jeremy was just there. He listened, he made me feel," she trailed off, realizing how ridiculous it sounded. "And I didn't make you feel that way?" I asked, the question hanging heavy between us. Her eyes finally met mine, and I saw a flicker of something I hadn't seen before, regret, perhaps even shame. "You did, once. But over the years. I don't know." I started feeling like I was fading into the background, like I wasn't seen, wasn't wanted. Jeremy was new, he made me feel alive. I took a deep breath, trying to hold back the torrent of anger and hurt welling up inside me. So, you thought sneaking around with him would solve that? You thought risking everything we had was the answer? She closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. I know it was wrong. I know I hurt you. But I didn't know how to stop. I thought I could handle it, that it would end before you ever found out. And before I found out? I couldn't help the scoff that escaped me. And then what, Molly? You come back home and pretend nothing happened. That's worse, don't you see that? Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she would break down completely. But instead, she wiped her tears, straightening up as if gathering what was left of her dignity. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I can forgive myself. But please, please let's try to fix this. I shook my head, laughing softly. Fix this? Molly, you destroyed everything. Trust doesn't get rebuilt overnight. I don't even know if it's possible at this point. But we can try, she whispered. I'll do whatever it takes. Therapy, counseling, anything. I'll stop seeing him. I'll quit my job if that's what it takes. I can't lose you, too. I watched her, trying to read her expression, to find some sliver of the woman I'd once loved. But all I saw was someone who'd shattered our life and was desperate to salvage what was left. I could tell she meant it, that she was terrified of losing the stability we'd built, of the consequences of her actions. But in her eyes, there was also the panic of someone who had been caught and was more afraid of losing her security than of losing me. Without another word, I got up, pulling out my wallet to leave cash on the table. This isn't the place for this conversation, I said, my voice cold. Let's go home. We drove in silence, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on us like a lead blanket. I stared straight ahead, hands gripping the wheel, while she sat quietly in the passenger seat, looking down at her hands. I didn't know what I was going to do. Part of me wanted to end it right there, to throw her things out and tell her to leave. But there was another part, a quieter part, that felt a need for a plan, a need to make her feel the depth of the pain she'd caused me. When we got home, she followed me into the living room, her eyes still red, her posture defeated. I stood by the doorway, watching her, wondering if this was real, if the woman standing in front of me was truly the person I'd known for all these years. Why him? I finally asked, my voice quieter than I intended. What does he have that I don't? She looked at me, eyes searching mine for understanding that I couldn't give her. It wasn't about him, really. It was about feeling seen, feeling wanted. I shook my head. You think I didn't want you? We have built a life together, Molly. You and I have been through so much. I thought we were a team. I thought so too, she murmured, looking down. Somewhere along the way, I lost myself, and instead of trying to find my way back to you, I looked for it in someone else. Her words were hollow, excuses that tried to put the blame on circumstance rather than on choice. She had made this choice, over and over again, each time she lied, each time she spent another night in a hotel room with him. I felt the bile rising in my throat, and I took a step back, needing space to breathe. I need time, I said finally. I need to think about what this means, about where we go from here. She nodded, the relief evident on her face, as if my words were some kind of reprieve. But she was mistaken. This wasn't forgiveness. This wasn't a second chance. This was a pause, a moment for me to gather myself and decide how to proceed. I turned away, heading down the hallway to our bedroom. As I closed the door behind me, I heard her footsteps retreating to the living room. I knew she'd be there all night, probably crying herself to sleep. But I couldn't bring myself to care. Her tears didn't move me. They were the product of her own actions, the consequence of the choices she'd made. Lying in bed, I stared up at the ceiling, the events of the evening replaying in my mind. Her face, her excuses, the way she tried to justify the affair as some kind of midlife crisis. I couldn't understand it, couldn't wrap my mind around the selfishness, the deceit. As I lay there, a plan started to form, an idea that settled over me with a cold clarity. I wouldn't end things abruptly, not yet. I wanted her to feel the pain she'd caused me, to experience the consequences of her betrayal firsthand. I wanted her to know what it was like to watch the person you loved turn into a stranger. It was a cruel idea, perhaps, but it was all I had left. Tomorrow, I decided, was the beginning of her reckoning. I woke up early the next morning, an unrelenting resolve settling over me. The house was quiet, Molly was asleep on the couch, curled into herself as if she could hide from the choices she'd made. I watched her for a moment, the woman I'd loved for so many years, now looking fragile and small. It was hard to reconcile this version of her with the one who had led a double life, with the person who'd torn our marriage apart so carelessly. But pity wasn't what I felt. I felt something colder, something that drove me to carry out the plan I'd thought up the night before. When she finally stirred, I was sitting in the kitchen, calmly scrolling through my phone, already one step ahead. She looked over at me cautiously, her face lined with exhaustion and worry. I could tell she was expecting me to continue the confrontation, but I had no intention of letting her off so easily. This wouldn't be as simple as an argument and an apology. She was about to learn what it felt like to have her world turned upside down. "Morning," she said quietly, her voice tentative. I looked up, giving her a curt nod. "Morning." The tension was thick between us as she poured herself a cup of coffee, her hands trembling slightly as she set the mug down and took a seat across from me. She opened her mouth, probably to offer another apology, another plea to start over, but I didn't give her the chance. "I think it's time we start being transparent with each other," I said, my tone measured. "So, here's what I need you to do." She looked up, startled by the sudden direction of the conversation. "What do you mean?" "I need you to tell me everything," I continued, folding my hands on the table, meeting her gaze with an unflinching stare. "Every detail. Every lie. I want to know every moment you spent with him, every excuse you made, every time you thought you were fooling me. And don't leave anything out." Her face paled, her hands tightening around the mug. I don't think that will help," she stammered. "It'll help me," I replied, my voice hard. "And you owe me that much." She hesitated, looking down at her coffee, probably trying to decide if she could refuse. But she must have realized it wasn't a request. It was an ultimatum. Slowly, she nodded, her shoulders slumping as she braced herself to dredge up the details she'd been so careful to hide. "It started, about 6 months ago," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'd met at a work event, just a casual introduction. At first, it was nothing more than that. But we kept running into each other at work functions, and over time, we got closer." I sat in silence, listening as she recounted how she'd fallen for his charm, his attentiveness, his interest in her. She went on about how he made her feel seen, as if that somehow justified betraying our marriage. Each word felt like a fresh wound, a new blow to whatever trust one still had in her. "We started meeting outside of work," she continued, her voice thick with shame. "It wasn't supposed to be anything serious. I told myself it was just a phase, something that would pass. But then, one night, we crossed the line." I clenched my jaw, fighting back the anger bubbling up inside me. I could picture it too clearly, her in some anonymous hotel room, giving herself to him with the same intimacy she'd once reserved for me. Every detail, every confession made the betrayal feel deeper, more real. "Do you regret it?" I asked, my voice cold. She looked up, her eyes full of regret. "Yes. I do. I regret all of it. I never meant to hurt you. I was stupid, selfish." I held her gaze, searching for any sign of sincerity. Maybe she meant it, maybe she didn't. But the damage was done, and no amount of regret would change that. Good, I replied, my tone icy. I want you to keep regretting it. She recoiled slightly, her eyes widening at the harshness in my voice. But I didn't soften. I was done being the understanding husband, the forgiving partner. She had shattered that version of me. I have to go to work, I said, standing up. But I want you to think about this conversation. Think about how easily you lied, how you managed to look me in the eyes every day and keep this from me. And when I come home tonight, we're going to talk again. But this time, you're going to tell me why I should stay. Without waiting for a response, I grabbed my keys and headed out the door. I could feel her eyes on my back, could sense the panic that was starting to settle over her. She was realizing, perhaps for the first time, that she might actually lose everything. The drive to work felt longer than usual, my mind replaying every word of her confession, every instance of her deception. Part of me wondered if I was being too harsh, if there was a way to forgive her and rebuild. But another part, a darker part, relished in the idea of watching her squirm, of making her feel the full weight of her actions. She'd wanted excitement, danger, a break from the monotony. Now she was getting it, just not in the way she'd planned. At work, I buried myself in tasks, meetings, anything to keep my mind off the chaos waiting for me at home. But even as I focused on the numbers, on the data, I couldn't fully escape the bitterness gnawing at me. I knew that revenge, however satisfying in the moment, wouldn't heal the wound she'd left. But I wasn't ready to forgive, not yet. By the time I got home, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the house. Molly was in the kitchen, looking anxious and tense as I walked in. She tried to offer me a tentative smile, but I ignored it, hanging my jacket and sitting down at the table without a word. "Did you think about what I said?" I asked, my tone sharp. She nodded, looking down, her hands twisting nervously. "Yes," she whispered. "I thought about everything." "Good. Because I'm not going to make this easy for you, Molly," I said, leaning forward. "You want me to stay? Then prove to me that you deserve it. Show me that you're willing to work for this." She looked up, her eyes filled with desperation. "I'll do anything, anything you want. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you." "Then here's what you're going to do," I said, my voice low and unyielding. "You're going to cut all contact with him. No more meetings, no more messages, nothing. And you're going to be transparent with me. Your phone, your emails, your calendar, they're all open to me from now on." She nodded quickly, relief flickering in her eyes as if she thought this was all I was going to ask. But I wasn't done. "And one more thing," I added, watching her closely. "You're going to tell everyone. Your family, your friends, even your colleagues if you have to. I want you to face the consequences of your actions. No hiding, no sweeping this under the rug. You're going to let them all know exactly who you are and what you did." Her face went pale, her eyes widening as she processed my words. But they'll never look at me the same way," she stammered. "Exactly," I replied coldly. "You wanted to keep this a secret, to protect your image, to save face. But you don't get that luxury anymore. If you want me to consider staying, you're going to do this my way. Full transparency." She looked down, her hands trembling as she realized the full extent of what I was asking. I could see the wheels turning in her mind, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. For the first time, she was experiencing the fear and shame she tried so hard to avoid. "Do you understand?" I asked, my voice quiet but firm. She nodded, her face drawn and pale. "Yes," she whispered. "I understand." "Good," I replied, standing up. "Then we'll see if you're really committed to making this work." Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her to sit in silence, to face the reality she'd created. As I headed up to our bedroom, I felt a grim satisfaction settle over me. She wanted to hold on to our life, to keep me as her safety net. But now, she'd have to fight for it, step by painful step. The next few weeks passed in a strained, uneasy truce. Molly did everything I asked. She showed me her phone and emails, cut off all contact with Jeremy, and even sat down with her family and closest friends to tell them what she had done. I could see the humiliation eating away at her, the shame darkening her once lively eyes. She was a shadow of the person she'd been when she was living a double life, and yet, even as she tried to piece things back together, something in me couldn't let go of the anger. I watched her fall apart, but instead of feeling satisfaction, I felt emptier, lonelier. One night, she came into our room, looking more fragile than I'd ever seen her. "I know I've hurt you," she whispered, sitting on the edge of the bed. "And I know I can't take it back. But I need to know. Can you ever forgive me?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to let go of the bitterness that had built up, to try and see her as the woman I'd once loved. But when I looked at her, all I saw were the memories of her betrayal, the nights she'd spent with someone else while I was here, trusting her, loving her. The words caught in my throat, and instead of answering, I looked away. Her face fell, and a flicker of hopelessness crossed her eyes. She reached out, placing her hand on mine, but I pulled away, unable to bear her touch. "I don't know, Molly," I finally said, my voice hollow. "I don't know if I can." She nodded, swallowing hard, and left the room without another word. I could hear her footsteps fading down the hall, the soft sound of her sobs muffled through the walls. But I didn't follow her. I couldn't. I lay there in the dark, feeling the weight of her sorrow pressing down on me, mingling with my own. The next morning, she was gone. At first, I thought she'd just left for a drive, maybe gone to clear her head. I waited, thinking she'd come back, that she'd be there by the time I came downstairs. But as the hours passed, a cold dread started to settle over me. Her car was still in the driveway. Her phone, her purse, everything was where she'd left it. It was as if she'd vanished into thin air. Panicked, I called her family, her friends, anyone who might know where she was. No one had seen her. No one knew anything. I called the police, filing a report, my hands shaking as I tried to explain that my wife was missing, that she'd been there the night before but hadn't left a note, hadn't taken anything with her. Days passed in a blur, each one heavier than the last. I barely slept, barely ate, waiting for some word, some sign. Every time the phone rang, my heart would race, hoping it was her, hoping she'd come home, that she'd forgive me for holding on to the pain, for not finding it in myself to let her back in. Then, one evening, a call came that would change everything. The officer's voice was calm, measured, but the words shattered me. They had found her, 2 counties over, near a riverbank. She was gone. She had taken her own life, leaving behind a single note, addressed to me. My hand shook as I unfolded the paper, her handwriting smudged and shaky. I tried to fix it, but I can see now that I broke something in you that can't be mended. I'm so sorry. I hope one day you can find peace. I love you, always. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes, and I sank to the floor, the weight of the letter pressing down on me like a vice. In that moment, everything I'd held on to, the anger, the need to make her suffer, the satisfaction I'd taken in watching her crumble, all of it felt meaningless. She was gone, and there was no undoing it. In the weeks that followed, I drifted through a fog of grief and regret, haunted by her absence, by the memory of her last, desperate question, could I ever forgive her? And the truth, the painful, gut-wrenching truth, was that I would have. I would have forgiven her, eventually, if I'd let myself. But I hadn't. I'd been too consumed by the need for revenge, by the bitterness that had filled every corner of my heart. Everywhere I looked, I saw traces of her, reminders of the life we'd once shared, of the love I'd never thought would end. And now, it had ended in the most tragic way, leaving me alone with nothing but a hollow emptiness where she used to be. I stood by her grave, the autumn leaves falling around me, a chill wind cutting through the air. The words on her tombstone felt like an accusation, a reminder of what I'd lost, of the chance I'd thrown away. In the end, my revenge had cost me everything.